Which is refreshing.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, it is my pleasure to welcome you to what will be the final CMS Colloquium of the year 2005, and what has been a really outstanding series of events this term. I'm happy to see visiting scholars and other visitors here joining us for this. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Grant McCracken, who is Flow. And many of you have read Pieces of Plenitude in one or another course that I teach, because I've been teaching that for a long time. He's been the director of the Institute of Contemporary Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum, a senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School, a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge, now an adjunct professor at McGill. Has consulted in the corporate world, and one of the interesting things about him is he's an anthropologist who really has become very engaged in corporate consulting with clients such as Coca-Cola, IKEA, Chrysler, Kraft, Kodak, and Kimberly-Clark. Apparently you have to have a C or a K in order to work with Grant McCracken.
Yeah, I'm having that C surgically.
It's sort of like a Batman villain thing, but it's, he's a member of the IBM ThinkPad Marketing Advisory Council, and of course he's part of the think tank we're creating through the Convergence Culture Consortium, another set of 3 C's here at the Comparative Media Studies program.
That's where we end up.
It's very spooky how our lives take this course. Almost all of my titles have P's in it for some reason, so.
Thank you, Henry. Well, thank you, Henry. Thank you all for giving me this chance to present an idea that I'm afraid you'll find a little delirious, and that's not just because I've been talking all day, but that I think will help. This set of reflections comes from the second of the 3 books that Henry mentioned, the one called Transformation, and you know, it's I think maybe a characteristic of the kind of discourse in which we're now all engaged as we try to think about how to think about a culture as various and dynamic and hard to read as our own. That there are moments where you feel like you kind of band together some of the things that belong together, and then they break apart and you reassemble them, and every constellation is a fleeting episode. And I have a feeling this is one of them, but what you hope, at least what I hope for with each of these constellations, is it gives you a sense of, oh yeah, okay, this is a kind of a thoroughgoing way of thinking about things. As I was mentioning to Henry in the class we were just in, you know, that's really what anthropology has traditionally brought to the party, is a kind of sometimes a fatal inclination to engage in holistic thinking, which is well and good when you're talking about traditional societies, face-to-face societies, groups of 150 people. Think holistically turns out not ever to have been easy, but not ever to have been impossible. But when you're working with our own culture, as various and disparate and changeable as it is, it's probably a fool's enterprise, but as you'll see, I'm kind of a modernist or pre-postmodernist kind of guy. That's sort of the theme of the talk. You'll see how that plays out. Okay. Oh, how frustrating. There. So, in our culture, it's customary, it's indeed expected that we talk about having selves. We're comfortable asking other people questions about their self. Sure shooting, if you were from another culture doing an ethnography of our culture, this would be one of the things that really caught your attention, one of the things you really want to follow up. It's kind of like, oh, you have one of these things called the self, do you? And how do you define it exactly? What is a self? And it's just like, you know, a lot of cultures just don't control themselves with something like this, which is not to say they don't engage in other kinds of exercise that sometimes look very like our notion of the self. But to use Geertz's definition, and he's here talking about the person, but I've borrowed it for the moment to talk about the self. But it's a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational, cognitive universe. a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively, both against other such wholes. So we have, you know, it's okay, indeed it's obligatory in our culture to talk about having a self. In fact, it's incumbent upon us to engage in the cultivation of something called a self. But this is, as Geertz is trying to point out, a particular way of looking at things. And it turns out that now we have grave doubts about this thing called the self. That just, you know, this kind of the owl of Minerva taking wing at dusk, just at the moment that we're beginning to think hard about what selves are and how they work and why we as a culture should care so much about them, the postmodernists give us the bad news, that in fact the self is not at all the way Geertz defined it. It's now a matter of multiplicity, heterogeneity, difference, and ceaseless becoming. This from Schrag. And it's that sort of, it's somewhere between the first definition and the second definition that this talk takes place. My plan, and I do have one. I want to present in the first section some ethnographic data. Gives us a chance to think about, I mean, that's the anthropological, it's a matter of postmodernist honor that you suppose that the self is multiple, and then you move on. For anthropological purposes, that's not on. You're obliged to see if you can't gather some of the ethnographic data that allows you to say that in our selves, in our culture, selves are multiple. And in the second section, then to present some good ways, perhaps, of thinking about this thing called the multiple self. And I'll use this as my theoretical support for the work of Emile Durkheim, a guy who gets almost no airtime these days at all. So I just see myself as this is a reclamation project. Some of you will remember from the late 90s a project by a guy called Mark Thomas called the Payphone Project. How many people heard of this? I thought it was better known than it is. That's interesting. That very few people in this room had heard of it. But it was a kind of sensation. What Mark did was gather up all of the payphone numbers he could find in the world, and he created a website. People submitted payphone numbers. Before you know it, Mark had 300,000 of these payphone numbers, and it became possible to call from your home any number of places, including the Vatican cloakroom, a bus station in Los Alamos. So you could just place your call anywhere and talk to perfect strangers, knowing only this one thing about them, that they were in the cloakroom of the Vatican. And sometimes that's important to know. And everyone, you know, you couldn't help it. It was a very 90s kind of thing, I think. And in fact, now it's over. It's been extinguished. It's been extinguished because payphones can't take incoming calls. So it's sort of sad that you can't call the cloakroom anymore, but you can't. And so the question was, well, what does this guy think he's doing? And I talked to a senior sociologist who just said, he's not doing anything, he's mad. This can't be taken as useful ethnographic evidence of anything wrong. But when you talk to Mark about it, he said, well, I like to use it. And what I do when I call one of these numbers is ask to speak to myself. Places a call to Vatican cloakroom and says, hey, is Mark Thomas there? A blonde guy with glasses? This is a man with certain knowledge that he's not there. You know, but he's asking if he is. And now to more familiar bodies of data. The Nutty Professor, when it was first, boy, this is tough to do from my perspective. Feel like I'm looking, I'm in the bottom of a well looking upwards. The first version in '63 was a classic kind of trickster story about a standard transformation that took Julius Kelp into a character called Buddy Love. And Buddy was interesting and filmically worthy, entertaining, because he was appetitive, reckless, liminal, all the things that make up the trickster character as we know it. What was interesting, in 1996, when Shadyac, is that how you say it, did a remake of this movie, Eddie Murphy played Sherman Klump, and everybody, and 7 other characters in the film. So it wasn't no longer not just 2 characters, but virtually everybody in the film was being played by by Eddie Murphy. So Murphy was the kind of the entire family. You say to yourself, well, maybe this is just special effects. This is what Jerry Lewis would have done if he'd been making a movie in an era where special effects were so good. But that appears to be the wrong way of thinking about this. In fact, when Peter Travers criticized Murphy for not even getting in touch with Lewis and talking about the creative possibilities here, Murphy, in response to this criticism, said to Letterman, well, genuinely puzzled, he said, well, why would I get in touch with this guy? Which told you in that ethnographic glimpse that he saw that the project was exactly the same but completely different. There was no point in talking to the previous creatures who had occupied this creative project. That Murphy saw this as a completely different cultural artifact and project. Hollywood, we can see this multiplicity theme has been played out now in Hollywood pictures several times in the last, let's say, 10 years. And these are some of the titles in which we see multiplicity or multiple selves played out. In fact, up until 2001, almost all of them failed to make their money back, which is a lovely moment in contemporary culture because we think of it as something that is driven by a sure grasp of what people want to see and an absolute obligation to make sure that investors get their money back. And here is Hollywood spending roughly $300 million on a theme they know is important. They're acting like avant-garde filmmakers. You can sort of barely see, yeah, there's something here. They don't know what it is, so they can't craft it correctly. They can't manage this cultural theme with sufficient sophistication actually to get people into the theater. More than that, all of these film stars bet a little piece of their career on this theme and suffered the consequences. And so far we can say, and now I'm using the anthropologist's idea of evidence, which makes anybody with quantitative sophistication to roll their eyes and roll their nose. These are ethnographic indicators as opposed to something absolutely reliable in the way of data. But I think these disparate pieces of data suggest that there is something like a multiplicity at loose in our culture, that Hollywood is implicated in our attempts to understand what multiplicity is, and that we don't quite get it. And it seemed to me that the way to think about it more exactly is to figure out why Meryl Streep is not in my spell check. I know these are the kinds of things that capture the attention of an anthropologist. I was struck when I put Spielberg's, I'm dyslexic, so of course I spelled Spielberg with the E before the I, and my spell checker said, what's the matter with you? That's not the way. My spell checker knows how Spielberg's name is spelled. Oh boy, that's pretty interesting. It's a culturally sophisticated spell checker. So what does it know, and what it's a lovely measure of things that are in and not in the core of contemporary culture. Turns out Meryl Streep is not in the pantheon of stardom. So why is that exactly? She has all the characteristics. She's gifted, she's accomplished, she's attractive, she's well known, she's much loved, she's long lived, she's a long career, but she's not hounded by photographers. She's not the object of ET coverage. I tune in every day. Nothing. Yeah, this crowd's inclined to go, oh, you too. Something keeps us from classifying her as a token of the type star. And that, I think, is deeply counterintuitive. I think it's an anthropological opportunity to glimpse something that's going on in our culture as it grapples with this thing called multiplicity. I can see some of you are going, yeah, I can see that too. I think Meryl Streep is not a star because she's not visibly transformational. She's not visibly transformational because she doesn't trail between roles. She doesn't carry parts of her movie roles into the world, right, as virtually every other star does. there's a kind of counter, what would we call it? A kind of, a pressing that's going on. The star takes some of their stardom into every role, and some of that role with them as they leave the movie into their stardom. Meryl Streep, on the other hand, to use the language of competitive diving, she enters the water cleanly. She nails the dive. She enters that part taking nothing with her. And she comes out as clean. She doesn't bring anything with her. And that's, I think, why she's not a star. And I think that perhaps tells us that she's not a star because she's not she's not engaging with multiplicity. That this celebrity culture is predicated on multiple identities and stars that carry meaning from role to role. That we perhaps, one of the reasons we revere stars is because they are transformational exemplars. But there's actually evidence that we go to the movies not just to see multiplicity on the screen, but to engage in it ourselves. Those of you know who the work of John Ellis, some years ago, when this was still Power of a Revelation, said, we go to the movies now, we're identifying with everybody on the screen, not just the hero. Which suggests that we are going to the movies to become more multiple than we begin. That identification in the movie house is multiple and fractured, a sense of seeing the constituent parts of the spectators and the psyche. So, the next question we have to ask is whether there's evidence of multiplicity in the world. Do people who are not fans engage in identity performances? And as a piece of ethnographic evidence, I now give you a conversation between Jean and Terry, two girls around 14. I overheard this conversation in the late 1990s. And I've reconstructed it from memory, so this is not perfect, and you'll forgive my modest dramatic abilities, but I'm going to try to recreate this conversation for you now. So Terry says, both 14-year-old girls, Terry says, okay, so Robert comes up to me last night, and he's like, so where were you last night? And I go, I was with Cheryl. Where were you? And he's all like mad and stuff, walking around and everything. She moves around in a hip-hop manner. Jane says, what is wrong with him? She does the same gesture. I'm so tough, she says, being Robert for a moment. Whatever, he's a loser. Terry says, so he goes, I thought you were going to be at Jimmy's. You said you were. Now he's a little boy, right? Ooh, you said. Jean and the voice of the child. Mommy, Terry said she was going to be at Jimmy's and then she wasn't. She puts on a pouty face. Terry, so I go, Robert, you make me sick. Jean cutting in, singing now in the manner of Pink, and this was not the song they used. I had to substitute this because I couldn't remember what song they were using, but it was as if they were singing the song by Pink, the lyric of which, the chorus of which is "You Make Me Sick."
It's you're a pill. You're just like a pill. You're making me ill. Sorry.
Is that? No, I think there's another
No,
song.
that's a different song. It's not
Yeah, I
about
think
Pink.
there's.
I'm
I
embarrassed
know the one
by
you
that.
mean, but I think this. I think so.
Instead of making me better, you're making me
I
ill.
know that song, but I think that's later. Well,
Sorry.
It's a thematic tie in the words.
it's a crucial exegetical issue, and we'll return to it.
I'm sorry.
No.
Terry says, there's something seriously wrong with that guy, and Jean responds, yeah, but you knew that. You said, oh, but Robert's so cute. Now it's totally Robert's an idiot. Now look what's going on here. I think we're looking at something, for want of a better word, we could call going. We wanted a label for this formed behavior. Interesting to the anthropologist. Terry and Jean both perform Robert in voice and gesture in two different moods. Terry does Robert as a child. Terry and Jean both do Pink. Jean performs Terry. These performances are sudden, brief, but relatively well formed. They are not elaborately framed. There's no proscenium. There's no and now kinds of presentations. What you get instead are little linguistic signals that say, look out, here it comes. And they are. You say, and he goes, and it was like, he was like, and now you know a performance follows. This is a kind of multiplicity of, yeah. Why do you know?
I've also noticed that, like, in certain cases, like, specifically in, like, groups where people like actually know each other really well. Like, you can without
Yes.
using words ahead of time, you just like change your tone of voice. And
Exactly.
everyone knows like
Exactly.
that you're thinking as events.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And that's kind of the joy of real friendship, is that you can slide in and out of these without no marking at all, and it makes it that much more kind of that much speedier, that much more entertaining. So you might say, well, teens, of course, they're creatures raised in a global village. Henry's magnificent work gives us a clear sense of the extent to which they have participated so deeply in a contemporary culture. They've made themselves the authors of it. So, of course, they would commandeer it for the purposes of performing themselves on the public stage. So are there other instances, actually, in which, is this just a teen thing or not? And I was interested in '98 when Mitchell interviewed Soderbergh and asked him how he prepared for the movie Out of Sight. And Soderbergh's answer I thought was interesting. He said to himself, if you blow this, you'll be doing art house movies for the rest of your life, and that's as bad as doing big budget things. I wanted to do both. I don't know if you've ever seen, I think his freshman film, Soderbergh's, where he plays, it's such a strange film that I have a bad memory of it. I'm not a bad memory, but an incomplete memory of it. I think he plays two people, and he makes absolutely no attempt to identify the difference between them, so you never know whether you're looking at character X or character Y. I mean, it's completely inspired for certain purposes, and Maniac in the other, but that's his idea of an art house movie. What he's saying here, what I thought was really striking about this is what, in the I'm a creation of World War II culture in which artists routinely had to tie themselves to this cross. The question was, were you going to be an artist, or were you going to go for the dough? And that everybody had to make that choice, and it crushed people. I mean, it was a difficulty of enormous intellectual and moral and personal proportions. And here's Soderbergh just going, problem, what problem? I'll have both. Systematically breaking with one of the real crucibles for personal identification, personal formation that had preoccupied his parents' generation. Bornstein, who says, I'm a transsexual lesbian whose female lover is becoming a man. Now this is particularly interesting because in our culture, gender is seen to be not so much cultural as natural. I mean, bless us for this misconception, but it's a deeply rooted misconception. So it's especially interesting to see a man who just goes, no, you don't understand. I make this as a matter of choice. The gender is fully optional, fully alterable, even when it means that Bornstein and his lover are effectively trading genders. This is a multiplicity. This makes for a heterosexual relationship where both parties know intimately the identity of the other because of their multiplicity. And lots of additional data here. Yo-Yo Ma, you think about, classical music has traditionally been a world hermetically sealed away from popular culture. You've got Yo-Yo Ma, one of the great princes of classical music, saying, no, I'm not. I will not be confined. I want everything that's going on in contemporary music. You've got Brian Eno, sounding like he's read a little bit too much string theory, possibly, talking about infinities with variations on the present that run parallel to the present in which we live. But David Brooks, this bestseller of a book in which he talks about boomers wanting to be, doing sort of what Soderbergh did, right? Just going, I'm not going to choose between being a bourgeois member of the suburb and being somebody who's bohemian and creative, and I'll take both, thank you very much. And Meyerowitz talking about adults who wish to be both adults and children. So lots of additional data. So just to sum up this section then, Lionel Trilling in '71 said that in that post-war period, we'd seen a fundamental shift from sincerity to authenticity. That we'd seen a movement from a pre-modern society in which what people most valued was sincerity. And by sincerity, they meant fulfilling the responsibilities given you because of the roles you occupy. Father, son, citizen, soldier, whatever. Your job was to accept these prefabricated, preformed identities and to fulfill them with all due sincerity. It's a very Victorian kind of notion. He's saying what's interesting about the 20th century and the modernist break from all of that is that now people didn't want to have all of these separate roles and these perfect enactments thereof. What they wanted was one true, perfectly authentic self. That's what now counted. And it looks like, if you want to take Trilling's argument one step further, that the signature of a postmodernist society is this willingness to, is it absolute indifference to sincerity, absolute indifference to authenticity, and now a real interest in multiplicity and the portfolio self. When actually did I start, just so that I'm keeping track of time? It's so hot in here. I can see some of you thinking, oh, gosh, I'm just going to talk for hours. I've seen guys like this before. He's just one of those guys who could just never shut up.
You have an hour and a half left.
And they rushed him and tore him. Yeah, it was like a Dionysian tragedy. No, really, how long have I been talking?
You've talked about half an hour.
Half an hour, good. So we're on schedule. Don't worry about it. I'm going to speed it up. Why is it so hot, though? Is it just me?
It's an engineer here that we have switched it all term long, so it's
Oh, okay.
not just you. You're not menopause.
Okay. So you won't mind interrupting. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, we're shifting genders.
Absolutely. You won't mind if I take off my shirt. Okay. So
open the door, but then the noise will come.
yeah. And the noise will get out. That's actually more okay, so that sort of rehearses some of the data that makes us think that maybe it makes sense to think about our culture as one that encourages, indeed insists upon, a multiplicity. So how do we think about this? Postmodernism is very straightforward, right? The postmodernism just says, well, this is simple. Cells are now multiple, they're loose-bounded, they're plural, they're heterogeneous. That the Geertzian self with which we began the talk is over. And that in fact, no, it's not just over, the Geertzian self is dead. And to prove it, we have a death certificate. Place of death, Paris, we think. Time of death, around 1972. This is tough, because I tried to calculate, when did the self die? And I think it's 1972. The problem is translation dates and the lag between the moment when books came, when these authors were published first in French and then in English. And I think it's not till their work gets into English that finally you get this, the absolute cumulative effect of their work. But the attending physicians, clearly, Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan, and that this is just now, many of us take for granted, a signature of the multiple self is the signature of the postmodern world. To return to Schragg's comment, and now to tag on the last 5 words, that these selves are about multiplicity, heterogeneity, different ceaseless becoming, bereft of origin and of purpose, he says. And it's those last 5 words that really make me nervous about the postmodernist project. George Levine, in a book published in '92, said that he thought he detected a certain malice or a glee in this postmodernist construction. That people didn't just think it was so, they very much wanted it to be so. He doesn't put it this way, but it's almost as if there's a wonderful moment which Trilling talks about the intellectual's responsibility to take up the adversarial or adversary intention. And you begin to wonder whether this notion of, this idea is dispatched and then left. You think about all of, if you can talk about a Western tradition, if you can talk about the accomplishments of a Western intellectual engagement, you'd have to say that the self is an artifact of astonishing interest and virtue. The things that, we now live in a world that's just almost random with variousness. And that's partly because we made good on this notion that there was a self. And we made freestanding individuals who engaged in acts of creativity that now leave us with the world that's just busting out all over. This is not what, believe me, from an anthropological point of view, this is not what traditional societies look like. Traditional societies spend a lot of time and a lot of energy making sure that change doesn't happen. When Levi-Strauss went to do ethnographies in Australia, with Australian tribes that have been ripped from various corners of that continent by government enforced dislocation, he wanted very much to see the ideas with which they were now struggling to make sense of this cataclysmic event. And they said, they said, oh no, everything's fine. We just rework the kinship system and it all makes sense. That they had effectively papered over an extraordinary seismic event that might otherwise have torn them out. And that at the limit is the capacity of traditional societies. Even when change is forced upon them, very often they're terrifically good at just saying, no, it didn't happen, here's why. So ours is a culture that now is predicated on change, and that's an old argument. Some of that comes from our ability to create this thing called a freestanding self that engages in acts of creativity, indifferent to traditions and orthodoxy. And to think that we're now just going to say in the postmodernist manner of things, well, that was fun, now it's over, it's just strange. You'd think you'd want to have a wake, at the very least. You know, you'd want to do something a little more ceremonial than just issue the death certificate and move on. So it is possible that there are other motives at work here in the declaration of the death of the self. And so if you want, I'm trying to resuscitate the corpse in order to scrutinize it, to interrogate it one more time. So I want to suggest there's maybe something dubious about this postmodernist approach, and suggest maybe an extra modernist approach. There is evidence, as the first section, part of this talk suggests, of a cessation of the unity of consciousness, centralized activity, single goal-directed action, the subject, the self. But there's also evidence that these are not so much disappearing as merely redefining themselves. That we've created new ideas of purpose, system, agency, and connection. That the individual, when we as individuals exhibit multiplicity, heterogeneity, difference, and ceaseless becoming, these are not symptoms with which we're left because of the death of the self. We're not, as Schrag put it, bereft of origin. Is that phrase, bereft of origin? What's the other word? That word. Anyhow, you remember. It's long ago.
Purpose.
Purpose, thank you. That these are now objectives more than they are symptoms. And I think they may be objectives that we pursue to a purpose. Just this data again, we've got Mark Thomas asking for himself. We've got the nutty professor, Murphy being all of those characters, not merely the obvious ones. Soderbergh wanting art and studio films. Give them both to me, he says. Ellis saying we identify with everybody on the screen. Borstein and a partner annexing one another in a manner of speaking. Keynes and the going from self to self. 12 movie stars betting their careers on and Hollywood, in fact, betting more than a career, $320 million of investment. What's interesting is that was a bet. If you look at the numbers, these multiplicity films fail until 2001, and then they start to succeed. It's almost like we go, oh, we know how to do this now. We learned. Anyhow, so that's the data. Here's another indicator, I think, that we're not looking at a self in crisis, in disrepair, that's collapsing in on itself. Because nobody, what we've done is given up. Remember, well, some of you are too young to remember, but as a child of the post-World War II era, I remember intellectuals bemoaning their pain, their difficulty. It was a modernist sentiment to feel yourself alienated, man, from the world, and to wear this as a badge of honor, to wear it on your sleeve as a demonstration that you had made good on the modernist bet and it was costing you. But you paid that penalty gratefully because, hell, that was the kind of person you were, a jazz fan, among other things. Nobody talks about postmodernist multiplicity as an affliction anymore. I mean, occasionally you'll say, gee, I just met myself coming down the hall.
right? You have that moment. I had it just a moment ago in the classroom when I was talking both to business school students and to comparative media students, and usually I speak to one group or the other, but talking to them both was really, I could see myself sitting in the corner of the room shaking his head. But you know, I don't complain, I don't think, oh, that's, I'm so alienated from myself. I just think, oh, that's kind of interesting and weird, and it's like, you know, it's just straight to the bar, and nothing that a pint of gin won't solve. So there's no complaints here. None of the people we've been talking about, Yo-Yo Ma, Brian Eno, Bobo's film goers, are protesting their conditioning. They're all going, bring it on. This is what I want. I wonder if we're not looking at what we might call an expansionary individualism. A creature that wishes to consume the world, that wishes to reproduce the world in itself. I wonder if we're not cultivating colonizing selves. According to Ellis, we identify with everyone on the screen, even the bad people, even the evil people. Why the dickens are we doing that? It breaks with the contract of Hollywood in a fundamental way. You know, it breaks with what narrative was supposed to give you the chance to do. But we want even the evil people, thank you very much. I wonder if purpose and agency are not over. I wonder if they're actually more active than they used to be, and perhaps a little frightening. It's almost as if we're looking at a duality of motive here, and interestingly, Daniel Bell, a guy I don't cite very often, captured this duality when he talked about the difference between instrumental individualism and expressive individualism. And before you rise up from your seats and rush the stage, I understand that, you know, when I use the term individualism, I'm rehabilitating an intellectual antique that most people thought was now rusting happily in a garage somewhere in Vermont. But let me play it out. I think maybe this expansionary individualism is being driven by pragmatic interests and by just a sheer freewheeling curiosity. But in both cases, we end up with an imperial self. Not interested in self-discovery, we're interested in world domination. We're not talking about, who cares about authenticity, discovering my one true perfect self? I just want to be everybody. Thank you very much. You know, it's an imperial model. It's an imperial model. So how do we think about this? It's not as if we've had to think about difference, diversity, and multiplicity before, but traditionally, this has been the work of political science. Pretty much what political science is for. And I thought to myself, what if we treated the self as a polity and applied political science models there too? And so I thought, you know, Rousseau would routinely talk about the difference between associations and aggregations. I mean, is that a useful language to think about the new multiple self? Could we think about the self as being an association one moment and aggregation in the other? I'm not well trained in political science by any means, so this is not a systematic survey. But the strategy is clear. We know how to think about multiplicity when it comes to social groups, when it comes to polities. We can say, yes, there are diverse groups within that, and we have models with which to think about how these groups define themselves and interrelate with one another. What if we say that group is the self, and it is made up of these sometimes warring factions? Durkheim is, this is my one special effect, and I couldn't be more proud. I actually worked an image into the presentation. But it's Durkheim. It's that image from that wonderful book by Stephen Luke's on Durkheim, where he dominates the whole cover of the paperback version, and he's just this. I mean, this guy, jeez. He's one of the founders of anthropology next to Morgan and Boas, and deeply interested in individualism. He says this idea of individualism, this idea of the human person, is the sole idea that survives immutable and impersonal above the changing tides of particular opinions. He says the self is a cultural creation, a social engagement, a collective and individual project. What's stunning about this? Okay, I'll just say this first. This is the 19th century, for crying out loud. It's just hard to imagine how brilliant this gesture was. This is the 19th century when France, when people, Hugo died in, I think it was 1885, maybe 1895. France was so desperate that they lost one of the architects of their culture, that people were making love on his funereal sculpture in the hopes of bringing Hugo back to life. I mean, they're doing it as a national gesture, which is always the excuse I use when I'm caught making love. I'm doing it for France. But here he is. You know, Silverman, in that wonderful piece of art treatment of France at the end of the 19th century, she says, you know, French culture, as we know it in the 20th century and now the 21st century, is a creation of the state. It's deliberate policy, and it comes from a time, you'd be a better judge of these matters than I am, and I hope this is right. But she argues that, in fact, France took a cold hard look at its national prospects and decided that they would lose all future military engagements to the German and all future commercial ones to the English. And they thought, what's our play? And they thought, culture, civilization, that's what we do. So at the very moment that this culture is creating this overwhelming notion of the dignity, the greatness of the collectivity, Durkheim is saying, you know what's interesting about all the things we can say about the world right now? It's the virus of individualism, loose upon the population. So here's the thing I want to do here. Originally, here's Durkheim's quote, and I want to use it to effect. As societies become more voluminous, constantly changing circumstances, as societies become more voluminous, their traditions and practices, in order to adapt to constantly changing circumstances, are compelled to maintain a state of plasticity and instability which no longer offers adequate resistance to individual variations. These latter, being less well contained, develop more freely and multiply in number. That is, everyone increasingly follows his own path. It's like plenitude. The guy nails plenitude. I mean, it's a magnificent gesture. But we can use this language, I think, to think about what an individual is, what an expansionary individual is. As individuals become more voluminous, their traditions and practices, in order to adapt to constantly changing circumstances, are compelled to maintain a state of plasticity and instability, and so on. You see how you can actually take some of these ideas crafted to take account of multiplicity in the social world and drop them into this discourse. So, okay, almost done. Just last thoughts. You know, I don't know whether this is a sort of a thought experiment. You give it a try and think, you know, does it help me think about the world? Yes, no. I'm not wedded to this stuff, but it's maybe a way to kind of think about some of the things we need to think about. And its first virtue for me is to inoculate me against the siren call of postmodernism, which a bit hard is. I think all of us, you know, you read that stuff and it's just intoxicating. And you start writing it. And that's the moment you start writing it after you finish reading it that you think, oh my God, the conversion is complete. But I think it's not an intellectual engagement, and I think it's created, at least in anthropology, and Ian may not wish to agree with me on this one. I think it's created a small crisis in anthropology. We're talking about the size of the anthropological bookshelf in bookstores today. It grows ever smaller because I think people have seized postmodernism as the occasion for an epistemological crisis that they now cannot escape. They literally can't do anthropology anymore, so freighted is the exercise with various moral, political, and most of all, epistemological difficulties. So that's one of its virtues, I think. It just says, you know, let's act as if this magnificent meaning-making machine, the philosophers for instance, created. Let's suppose, I mean, anybody with their wits about them knew about the epistemological difficulties of any intellectual engagement. Everybody knew that categories were abusive of the real subtleties and variations and the sheer inscrutability of the world. That categories were always provisional, and let's just say this is true. I mean, only the Platonists thought otherwise. Or in the Aristotelians. Oh, and also but mostly, you know, in the latter day West, we understand that. So it just seems to me let us put some of those issues aside. But just to honor the notion, which is, of course, one of the issues here is what difference does this make to our understanding of culture and commerce? There's one kind of simple point that really jumps out. Marketing was transformed by the notion of segmentation. And suddenly, people went from being kind of thick-headed about how to think about markets and said, okay, well, we'll make discriminations. We'll distinguish between demographically and in terms of ethnicity and nationality and so on. And it's clear that that idea is now deeply under challenge because there just are so many categories right now. But to make things even more difficult, it seems to me we have now to think about the segmentation within, how the diversity, the differentiation, the heterogeneity of the consumer must now be taken account of. And it makes marketing a vastly more difficult process. Okay, just one more, I think. Oh, and the other thing here that strikes me is that, you know, the intelligent systems that we get from Amazon, Netflix, and social software almost always disappoint, I think largely because they're not taking account of multiple self. You know, make a few purchases for somebody else, make a few gift purchases on Amazon, and you have to endure a couple of weeks of real noise because the system just goes, oh, your taste has changed. So there are some straightforward possibilities here. So anyhow, there is evidence, finally, now closing. There is evidence, multiplicity, Hollywood's engagement with this multiplicity, the fact that we don't quite get it, that are now grappling to do so. Evident, I think, in every province of contemporary society, not just the early adopters and the keenest innovators. But I'm not sure that we want to, for my money, the postmodernist bet with the devil is extremely expensive. It gives you a way of thinking about our multiplicity, but it costs you the opportunity for other kinds of inquiry. And if you forswear that bargain, I think maybe we can glimpse something like an expansionary individualism. And the self now very messy, entirely emergent, but perhaps not yet over. Thank you.
Questions and comments?
Yeah.
So Hinduism looks at the self as something
Who does?
in the Hindu religion.
Right.
So the self is really important because they say
Yeah.
you are everyone and you are everyone, everyone is within you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you're looking at other cultural connotations.
Yeah. I haven't actually, and that's a real failing, and it would be fascinating to hear Ian on that question. And it's a huge analytical opportunity at my disposal as an anthropologist, but I've been working so hard on
Innovations.
Yeah. Yes.
I was intrigued by your reference at the beginning of the trickster.
Right. Right.
But I'm curious now, it has me thinking about what's the role of the trickster in our current society? I mean, originally the trickster was to sort of allow people to go crazy for a little while and reintegrate, but there's never a point of reintegration. Yeah, and all I can think now is like Johnny Depp was about to be our trickster figure.
Oh, I have a friend who argues that it's that, you know, that new genre of DJ, comic, improv artist, Tom Green, Ali, what's his name?
Ali G.
Yeah, Ali G. And there are a couple of others of people who engage in effectively, you know, their journalism, so-called, their media engagements become sort of very tricksterish to the extent that they're really just sending up the genre, or exploding the convention, even as they. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be my bet that they are. Yeah, sorry, what was your question? I don't think I gave you a chance to ask her a question. I think I just.
What was the? I'm kind of wondering at this point what the role of the trickster
Oh.
character is if we have this multiplicity and we never need to reintegrate.
Yeah.
Has the role of the trickster changed? And yet at the same time it seems more powerful than ever.
Yeah.
We're all tricksters.
Well, we certainly have a liberty. I mean, the real mythic trickster is an astonishing character that eats children and, you know, births villages, and it does things that even in our most multiple moments we can't imagine being in the ambit of a human being. So
Actually, my favorite recent trickster story discovery is Coyote being able to juggle his eyeballs.
Yeah.
Because I'm going, prosthetics.
Yeah.
Coyote was there first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's the question, I guess, in virtual domains. you can now contemplate tricksterish gestures that and that's, I mean, that's, I recently joined, a couple months ago, I joined Second Life with the idea that it might be a really interesting place to do anthropology, and that it might be a way you could train people in anthropology to the extent that other people in Second Life would sit still for interviews, and I discovered very quickly that many of them won't. You know, it is an opportunity to engage in another kind of anthropology, another opportunity for anthropology. I can't remember what Are we all trickster? Yeah, and you can see some amazingly tricksterish stuff going on. Though too much of it, for my own purposes, too much of it was formed by like S&M kind of conventions from this world, and I thought it just was not tricksterish enough. Yes, to make that. But the virtual opportunity should make, to the extent that it allows us to break the laws of physics, and you know, and virtually all and any social convention should really open up. Yeah.
I wonder if the idea of the self as multiplicity changes the way how we are able to speak about it, actually, because some of the style that you have is reminiscent of postmodernity, but it's, I think, more clear and more rigid in its way of phrasing things. And I think that's something that really, it's maybe a good way to deal with it, because it allows for multiple readings, but at the same time suggests one over the other. So I wonder if that's a particular problem in anthropology at the moment.
Yeah. Its discourse is what's the word I want here? There's like there's a hydroplaning effect. You can't take any one assertion as the locus of the argument. You have to read a couple hundred words and you go, okay, I get what they're saying. But that leaves you without a precise specification that you can examine, scrutinize. You know, and listen, I'm not asking for the restoration positivism or anything like, you know, as crude as, you know, angry-minded tests of, you know, show me the evidence down there. That's not what I mean, but at some point you should know, okay, this is what the proposition is. Because so many propositions are, if they're off by even a few degrees, they're bad, right? And so unless you can specify them quite clearly, so that's just my inclination there, is to say, be as clear as you can. Because otherwise, this stuff is so difficult to think about that if you indulge in a kind of wind-blown rhetoric, it's like, for me. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how technological development is affecting the perception of self? Because I can look at it from two sides. One is that you say the internet allows me to go online and be whoever I want, but there are other mechanisms like blogs or a personal website that allow me to sort of post the world my perception
Right.
of self. So
Yeah.
how does that change the self?
Yeah, that's a great question. Which means I don't have an answer. No, I do have an answer. You know, one of the things that made me first wonder about an expansionary self was watching what people were doing on chat lines. I had a friend who would go and steal people's identities and then pretend to be. She would persuade people to give them their identities, and then she would be them. Which is roughly equivalent to something I once did at a conference where I took somebody's, when they were signing in, I took somebody else's badge and embarrassed them for, like, you know. But she was doing this with, you know, it was clear, kind of a tricksterish kind of notion, but it was really expansionary. She just wanted to be this person. So, it doesn't quite answer your question. Just remind me, it was such a good question.
I guess I'm just curious about how technology and the progress of personal communications in particular, or even media consumption, might contribute to or detract from this sort of trend toward
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the case of the stealing of identities and masquerading as somebody else, the technological possibilities really just open things up very nicely. But your point about blogging is very good, because there's lots of modernists kind of, let me show you how precious and interesting and special myself is, and that's what the blog is for. It's self-advertisement of a kind. And I see, you know, I post every day, and I feel this tension, because, you know, if you want to participate in the wisdom of crowds, you've got to, you know, breathe in and breathe out much more. You know, all this kind of, the blogs end up being special statements of my authenticity, and to that extent, you've really just created a freestanding little habitation somewhere in the wilderness, and nobody, you know, it's like not very interesting. So yeah, I think we'll see. The question there maybe is, how can you be an egoist and a participant in the wisdom of crowds? How do you get paid when what you're doing is saying, it's not really about me. It's really about all these people thinking about all these issues in consort. And we're working together to work out some of these problems. That's sort of selfless, and we are to some extent. This expansionary creature is still driven by ego. In fact, it's especially egoistic. It wants to be everybody. So that's a nice tension. I hadn't thought of it that way.
If I could build on that,
Please.
that question, it seems to me, I'm thinking about games as being one example of how technology enables people to see multiplicities of power rather than as a problem. And I'm thinking about a game like Street Fighter II, which comes out fairly early in history of the medium, in which for the first time, one of the first games where you could choose which character you wanted to be, and you could choose it based on the different powers. So you had the small Asian women who spin fast, and you had guys who could stretch their arms far, and big, strong guys who take a lot of punishment. So the idea that you would choose who you were in the game based on different capacities, but those capacities would be evenly balanced, and that each time you played, you might come back and be a different person in that scenario, seems to really change the way, I mean, alter in some ways the way you would think about multiplicity.
Yes.
Because it's no longer just a self that's fragmented. It is a self that willfully can shapeshift and become multiple identities, and each one can make you stronger. And your ability to click between them makes you a better player than the ability to be fixed in your way. So the guy who can only play one, he's going to be at a real disadvantage playing against someone else compared to someone who can play all of those roles.
Right. But it sounds like each of those roles demands a trade-off. You can have more of this, but you have to give up more of that. And it feels like this expansionary self, at its most competitive, says, I want all of these. I mean, it's truly superhero-ish. You know, it wants it all, which is interesting kind of problem, because the technology kind of makes that possible. Then it is the superhero problem. Where's the dramatic tension when the superhero is utterly powerful and without, right? Then